So it's Wednesday, around 12:30. I'm a little early today, but it's time for me to put up my devotional. So for those that have been following along, welcome. If this is your first time watching one of these videos, I've been working my way through the book of Proverbs in the Bible, one verse at a time, and just looking at the wisdom that it teaches us and learning how to serve God better and to become wise. And from this book, the whole point of the book of Proverbs is to teach godly wisdom. So that's the journey in your own devotional life. Great. That's the point, is just to give you something to think about with regard to each verse. Today we're in chapter 2, verse 14, and we're going to take a look at that just to remind us all of the context. The verses of chapter 2 of Proverbs are making a point that if we will pursue the wisdom of God, we will treasure it and really value the wisdom of God, take it into our heart, then it will become the shield and protection to us, and it will guide us into making good decisions, good both pragmatically and morally, making good decisions. And that's the whole point of chapter 2 in particular of Proverbs. And so it's making that point. It's saying if you do this, then you'll have this. And when we get to verse 14, it says, I should back up a little bit. Somewhere around verse 9, I believe it is. It says, that the wisdom becomes a protection from delivering us from people who delight in doing evil and rejoice in the perversity of evil. Now, yesterday, I talked a little bit about this idea of how people who choose to leave the path of righteousness, uprightness, to pursue and walk on a path of darkness or evil, and how we have to be careful about the desire for people to draw us onto that path with them. And that's part of godly wisdom, is learning how to reach out to try and help those people come back to righteousness, but also how to not be drawn in by them to join them on their path of darkness. And so that's what we talked about a little bit yesterday. And today the verse just builds on that idea that people who've chosen to walk on the path, to leave the path of a righteous, moral life to embrace a darker path, then there's something really terrible that happens to them, to their spirit, to their heart, to their life. And that is that they move from a person who simply is walking a path of darkness to someone who delights, as this verse says, to those who delight in doing evil, to delight in doing evil and rejoice in the perversity of evil. They find happiness in the perversity of evil. Understand what this verse is not saying. It's not saying in this verse, those who delight in what they get out of doing evil. It's actually saying those who delight in the doing of evil. They like to do the evil thing because it's evil. And that's a pretty awful state. Imagine a person getting to a place where they cease to be moral, and they slowly become so corrupted by that they actually take pleasure in being immoral. And that's a real thing. And that's what this verse is kind of referring to. And it's saying that if we allow God's wisdom into our life, we can be delivered from that outcome, from going down that road and becoming that kind of a person and falling into the traps of life that those people end up in. So that's kind of the idea. So let's go through our 4 questions. Question number 1, how could anyone enjoy evil unless they were already some sort of psycho, some sort of evil person, right? And so there's this idea, is it really something that I need to worry about? Because we can tend to look at a verse like this and go, wow, that's for those psycho people, those really bad people. That's for like Stalin and Hitler and people like that. And we tend to think that there's nobody, there's only certain people who could go that bad. But that's not what the Bible teaches. And I would argue that's not even what modern psychology teaches, that there's actually a possibility for any human to fall into this. It can happen to anyone. It's like acquiring a taste for something like sugar or fat. Anybody who eats it can acquire a taste for it pretty much. Maybe there's some rare cases where that wouldn't be the case, but if you decide to eat unhealthy food, you can acquire a taste for unhealthy food. Or if you decide to eat particularly, strange foods, you can acquire a taste for that. And not only can you, but in a sense, it's actually worse than that. Would you think, for instance, that only certain people would ever become addicted to drugs. Only certain people, right? Like most people could take drugs and never become addicted to them. Is that what you think? Would you? You'd be wrong. Drugs have an addictive, certain drugs, I guess, depends which drug we're talking about, but drugs, we're talking about those hard, not so good drugs. They have a tendency to create an addiction in people. They're addictive in nature. It's why one of the reasons they're so terrible is because they're very addictive in nature. And it doesn't matter who you are, right? As if somehow you are the one that's immune to that. If you decide to walk the road, you will become addicted. And it's like that. We tend to think that way with evil. We think that, only certain people would ever kind of enjoy evil, that will go down that far. But yet, no, anybody who walks the path of darkness, that decides to become immoral, you start walking a path that leads to darker and darker places. And any one of us could fall into that trap. It's a real serious thing. What does it mean to delight in doing evil? That's question 2. What does it mean to delight in doing evil? Like, are we talking about only talking about people like become sadists or mass murderers or whatever? And it's like not only talking about that. I mean, obviously that's an example, but when we talk about the path of darkness, there's a whole lot of things attached to that. The moral code of a human being has to span their whole life. Like everything we do has some level of a moral code to it, and people that allow themselves to be corrupted by choosing an immoral path can find themselves enjoying all sorts of ungood things, not just the fruit of it, but the actual fact that it's not good. I don't know if you've ever met people like this. I've in my profession, I have encountered and had to have interaction with some people who've gone very bad this way, where it was just like they just really liked to hurt people, or they really liked to upset the cart, or they liked to have people angry, or they liked the idea that they got away with something. And this is what can happen to us. We can fall into this place where just there's something attractive to us about being bad. I mean, we have that built into our culture, don't we? The idea of the bad boy. Why do you think it is that so many people like dark heroes? Like, it used to be that we used to have in our media, we'd have heroes who were the good guy, very clearly the good guy. But more and more now we find in our television shows and movies and books that the hero is actually more of a bad guy. Sometimes he's a misunderstood bad guy, or more often now, though, it seems like he's just a bad guy. He's the protagonist of the story, but he's just not a good guy. And people are drawn to that, right? And that's just an example of how that path is attractive to people. When you walk it, it draws you deeper and deeper into it. Question 3, don't people tend to be basically good? And this is the battle in so many people's minds, aren't people just basically good though? I mean, and I guess the answer to that is, well, I don't think so. I don't think the Bible says that. I think there's a battle in people between good and evil. But just ask yourself the question, which is easier to do? If you want to know whether or not humans are basically good or basically not good, evil, dark, which is easier to do, good or evil? Which is easier to do, create or destroy? Which is easier to do, take responsibility for your actions or deny responsibility? Is it easier to work or procrastinate? It's easier to do the not good things. Why is that? Why isn't it easier to do the good things? Well, that's because somewhere inside of ourselves, there's a draw away from the good. And we just need to recognize that. The fact that humans have potential for good is a wonderful thing. But there's a natural draw away from good because of, well, in our theology as Christians, we say because of sin. Because of sin in human life, it draws us away. We're fallen creatures. This is why the Bible tells us we have to answer wisdom's call. We don't start there. We have to answer the call to wisdom and move into a path of righteousness and following wisdom, treasuring wisdom in our heart, so that we don't go the easier path into darkness and to the place where we would actually end up enjoying being dark, enjoying being evil, which was a terrible, corrupted place to end up. So question 4, how are we supposed to think well of ourselves if we think that there is an evil tendency in us? I think that's one of the reasons so many people reject the idea that in the human heart is a darkness, is Because how do you have good self-esteem if you think there's a darkness inside of me? I don't want to think that. So we try to reject that idea so I can think better of myself. But it's a real mistake to think that your self-esteem needs to be based on some sort of intrinsic self-worth. Instead of thinking of your self-esteem as being something I can build by doing well, by actually choosing good, and by doing and choosing a good course in life, and I can feel better about myself. So to sort of wrap up that idea, I just want to tell you the story from Genesis. It's not a very long story, a short story. In the early part of the book of Genesis of the Bible, there's a story about two brothers, Cain and Abel. And these brothers both came before the Lord and offered a gift to God. And we're not told what happened, but Abel, the one brother, gave a gift, and God was happy with it. It was a good gift. And Cain, he gave a gift that was quite inferior for whatever reason. That's not the point of the story, but it just simply tells us that there was something inferior. And so God wasn't pleased with his gift. And so Cain saw that his brother Abel was approved and that Cain wasn't. The path that Cain was taking wasn't a good one. The path that Abel was taking was a good one. But Cain became annoyed by this. And he started to get tempted in himself with anger and wanting to do violence to his brother. So there's a verse in verse 7 of chapter 4 of Genesis where God speaks to Cain and he says this. He says, if you do good, do the good thing, will not your countenance be lifted up? The idea, you'll be happier. And if you do not do well, then sin is crouching at the door. Its desires for you. You have to master it. And in that little story in the book of Genesis, it just gives us this foundational truth about humanity, that we shouldn't think that I deserve the positive appraisal of God just because I'm me. Instead, God says to Cain, no, do well and you'll be happier. And if you don't do well, then there's going to be a corruption occur in you. Sin's crouching at the door. It's going to corrupt you. You got to master that. Come back to doing well and you'll feel better about yourself. You'll be happier. And I think that's just re-emphasized in Proverbs. Do well. Don't deny that there's a tendency in us to not do well. Instead, overcome that. Master it. Do well. Do what's right. Stay on the path of righteousness instead. So that's something for you to think about today from Proverbs. Treasure godly moral wisdom and remind yourself of how terrible it is to not have it, and where we could end up. Anyway, that's it for today. God bless us all. Help us to do this, to pursue wisdom once again and avoid the corruption of evil, I pray in Jesus' name. God bless. God willing, we'll be back on tomorrow. I'll probably be later tomorrow, but anyway, sometime tomorrow we'll do another one. God bless.